welcome everybody to this Green Christian workshop, which, as you know, is part of a, we hope, monthly series of workshops on a range of topics of interest to Christians, we hope of all stripes, but particularly those with a focus on environmental issues. We're very pleased to introduce Tim Cooper to speak to us today with his title, which you've all seen, Faith in Fashion, Christian Perspectives on Unsustainable Clothing Practices. Many of you will be familiar with Tim, but for those who aren't, he is Emeritus Professor of Sustainable Design and Consumption at Nottingham Trent University. After he graduated in economics from the University of Bath, he worked in the construction and food industries before starting his research career at the New Economics Foundation. He was awarded a PhD from Sheffield Hallam University in 2001 and appointed to a chair at Nottingham Trent University in 2010. He's internationally recognized for his research on the lifespan of consumer durables and has led several research projects on sustainable clothing funded by Defra and WRAP, and other Waste and Resources Action Program. He's also a trustee of Green Christian and was indeed a co-founder and first served as its first National Co-ordinator. He's also a past chairman of its board, the board. So just before we move on to Tim's talk to us about what is and isn't sustainable, about recyclability and what Christians can justify in their choices of clothing, if we just join together in a short prayer. Lord, you told us not to worry about what we will wear, to consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. Yet for us, toil and spin we must, to meet the clothing needs of the lives we live in, the society of which we are a part. At the same time, we are called to care for your creation and for each other, to use wisely and well the gifts you, creator of heaven and earth, in your grace have given us. Be with Tim as he speaks to us, and as we listen to Tim's talk and consider our responses, may we be guided by your love and wisdom. Amen. So Tim is going to speak for something like 30 minutes, possibly slightly shorter, and then we'll go into breakout rooms for 10 minutes with a couple of questions for you to focus on. And after that, we'll return for some feedback and a period of Q&A. And we aim very much to be finished by 8:15. So, Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for that. And I'm sharing my screen, I hope successfully. It's a delight to actually give this presentation. I think it's the first time I've spoken on fashion from an overtly Christian perspective. It leads me to a real problem, which is the difficulty in trying to fit everything into half an hour. And I'm going to apologise from the outset that I'm going to go quite quickly through these PowerPoint slides. I'm not going to spend much time on some of the minutiae detail on them, but they will be made available to you. So if certain elements of it catch your eye and you worry that you've missed the particular slide or couldn't take notes or whatever, I'm very happy to pass the slides on and allow you to read them in any length that you want. And Paul was trying to get the balance between giving you technical information, theological information, ideas, and we'll see how that goes as I go through. But I'll spend no more time on the preface, but to say a bit of context. And some of you who've got an interest in clothing and fashion will have seen publicity, articles, programs highlighting just how unsustainable the fashion system is. And fashion I'm defining here broadly as items that adorn us, things that we wear. And you'll see just from the list of points to the left-hand side, the kind of problems that we're facing. Firstly, that we're seeing the growth of faster and faster fashion production. So with global production doubling in the past 15 years. and some of the impacts that have, whether we're talking about its contribution to climate change, the huge water consumption involved in cotton in particular, and indeed the pesticides and other chemicals used in cotton. If you think to yourself, well, I won't wear cotton anymore, I'll wear synthetics like polyester. Well, of course, polyester is fossil fuel based, and it also takes 200 years to decompose. So the starting point of this conversation is there are no easy answers. And I've been at Nottingham Trent for some 15, 20 years. I've worked with them for 20 years now. And there are quite a lot of questions which are still very much unanswered, even by those with expertise. There are some things that have been answered, and I'll turn to some of those, but there are some issues that are still problematic. We need to address this locally as well as globally. In the UK, although the industry has, in my view, long woken up to the need to address sustainability. At the same time, despite many measures that are being taken, consumption is still going up, and therefore the impact of the sector is still going up. And we're still seeing a really big problem with the fact that much clothing is not recyclable, and much clothing ends up in landfill or waste to energy plants every year. There's very little recycling taking place, and I'll turn to that in a moment. Those of you who are interested in some of the issues I've raised already, if you look to the bottom right-hand side, there's a report called Valuing Our Clothes, the Cost of Fashion. It's probably the best and biggest report that's been done outside government recently. It was produced 5 years ago, a little bit out of date, but that's available online. There's also one by a House of Commons Select Committee, a bit more recent, but obviously taking a slightly different position. But WRAP, an NGO, a charity, who do some really excellent work in this area. Just to highlight some of the problems that need to be addressed. How can the power of vested interests in not just the clothing industry, fashion, but also associated industries like mass media and the cultural sector, sports and music, be challenged? So in other words, it's not just a question of getting people to wear longer lasting or fewer or recyclable clothes. There's a whole transformation needed, because many journalists depend on fashion, on changing fashion all the time, to write articles on that. Football clubs like fashion, they change their garments at least once a year because they make a lot of money out of selling football shirts. Music, the whole music industry is based on change, pop music in particular, and a lot of their money comes from associated sales, not just streaming. So there's a huge amount of power involved in this world of ever-changing clothing. I mentioned a moment ago, there's some companies in the industry have done some good thinking in this area, and that might be a surprise, but I've had conversations with some of the leading companies in this country. I remember one 3 or 4 years ago, sat down with the young lady who oversees their sustainability work, national brand, and she said, we need to maintain our profitability, but we know we've got to reduce the volume of clothing. We need to sell fewer garments, but we need to maintain our profitability. How do we do that? It's the real enigma. We don't know how to do that, how to achieve that, for a lot of reasons, not least the fact that people have got used to buying cheap items, not longer lasting items. And that's a real problem. And it's a problem particularly for the young, because a lot of fast fashion is aimed at young consumers, and a large proportion of the clothing market is for young consumers, but they haven't got large salaries, so they only want to buy products that are cheap. Hence the growth of companies like Shine and Boohoo and Pretty Little Thing and the like, all of which aim at young consumers without much money. And yet we've seen change amongst young consumers, particularly in the areas of food, who can't ignore the growth of publicity, if not practice, on veganism, and certainly has been a growth of veganism, if not vegetarian, or in fact both together, but less of a trend, although a trend to a degree, in young consumers rejecting fast fashion. There are, of course, a growing number of young people who are very happy to buy second-hand now, and we can touch on that that later. I've said most of what I'm talking about is aimed at UK consumers, but it's a global industry. And one of the problems we have, I mentioned the fact that we only reuse a small proportion of our garments, and many of our unwanted garments are, if not put in landfill, they're shipped overseas to markets in developing countries. Some of which are used, and that's a good thing, particularly if they haven't got their own industries there. But also, we suspect some of them just end up in landfill overseas, which really is problematic. And then the last issue is this one of recycling. The much clothing isn't easily recycled technically, let alone economically. And work is being done in that area, but not nearly quickly enough. Consumers are at the heart of this. If consumers rejected fast fashion, then obviously there wouldn't be a problem. Consumers are increasingly aware of the problems promoted by people like Stacey Dooley, the TV personality who did a very well-received program called Fashion's Dirty Secrets. We've seen the growth, as I hinted at a moment ago, of secondhand clothing, and that's been attracted particularly to young people through apps such as Depop and Vinted. If you look at what's going on has been going on in secondhand stores, if you go into the average secondhand store, certainly where I work in Nottingham, there's an area called West Bridgeford, which has a lot of secondhand stores, and the stores have to sell secondhand clothing as if it's new. No longer is it credible, realistic, or has potential to actually just chuck clothes in there and hope people go through them as if they're in a jumble sale in the 1960s. They really have to be presented well, because it's a very competitive market now, selling secondhand goods and secondhand clothing in particular. Consumers have problems. They have problems of a budget to be able to afford high quality garments. Not everyone can afford a Patagonia jacket, for example. They also lack confidence in their ability to repair or alter items. Although I've done survey work, which has found that many would like to be able to do that. And there's always a problem about inadequate consumer information, that labelling is not good. Often the labelling actually doesn't guide consumers towards being able to buy more sustainable clothing. The market in sustainable clothing has changed. There have been improvements over the years, although progress is not that fast. I can remember probably 10, 15 years ago being able to buy fair trade organic t-shirts at Marks and Spencer's. I'm not even sure I can now. There might even been a decline in that area. But there is a real problem with labelling, which is a lot of the impact of clothing depends on how it's used. Has it been, for example, washed too frequently? People don't throw things into the laundry every time they use them, and that has quite a high proportion of the environmental impact of clothing. Things like, for example, how long will it last? Well, that depends on how you use it, how you wash it, what temperature you wash it at. So there are many factors that come into play that actually are problematic for labelling. But there are things that companies could do to label products better. Say, for example, that it's double stitched to reduce the likelihood of a seam going, or that it's designed with a dye with a good fixing agent so that the product won't fade until 100 washes or whatever. Right, sorry, we've gone on to the end already. Right, I want to spend a little moment now, before looking at some of the latest research on sustainable fashion, about how we come to as Christians. And there have been some interesting developments in recent years in this area. Why does fashion exist? I think is the first question we need to ask. And there are several answers one could give. One is it reflects our creativity. People like new things. They like change. Much fashion is aesthetically pleasing. It might demonstrate something about the person, leading on to the next point, that it's about self-expression and identity. People want to show who they are by what they wear. And of course, a bit more cynically, it's about commercial profitability. Companies benefit by people coming back and buying clothes again and again and again. There are issues with sustainable fashion that are, as I mentioned earlier, unresolved. A lot of my work is to do with garment longevity, how long stuff lasts, because we know that many garments are thrown away that are still quite acceptable to wear. But there are problems when you start saying, well, if you make it last longer, what you do, for example, with cotton is add a bit of polyester, have a cotton polyester mix. That makes it more durable, but then it becomes non-recyclable. So you say, okay, well, forget the mix. We'll just go just to polyester, but then it's made from a fossil fuel. So that's not better. So there are lots of sort of tensions here in the discussion. But from a Christian perspective, what do we do? Well, historically, I grew up at a time when in the 1960s and 70s, I went to university in the 70s. And at that time, you could spot a member of the Christian Union walking down the street because they were the least fashionable people. At that time, particularly in the more conservative evangelical sides of the church, which tended to be where the Christian unions were strongest, there was a kind of dualistic thinking that material things are bad, spiritual things are good, therefore I don't need to look at what I wear because God's concerned about my inside, not my outside. And that'll be a distraction in any case. That's changed over the past 30, 40 years now. So there's, not amongst all Christians, of course, but generally, many more Christians are much more accepting of fashion. And while they might not go to the extreme of asking what would Jesus wear, they would at least see it's perfectly valid to be fashionable as a Christian and not something that is countering their inner spiritual beliefs or sense of self. And at a more popular level, of course, Christians are supposedly out there to demonstrate the world the kingdom of God. In other words, a world of good ethics. And a range of different topics come to mind from fashion that we all read about in the mass media. Things like, for example, injustice in clothing factories in the third world, cotton pickers using child labour, accidents such as Rana Plaza about 10 years ago, which led to the death of hundreds of people, and problems with the materials I've used earlier. So there are a lot of issues that from a Christian we can see can spring to mind. And perhaps the person who's done the most work in this, and someone who I have to admit, I've only come across, to me, he's come across him recently, but he's only been writing this area relatively recently, is a guy called Robert Cavolo. And he wrote a book in 2020 called Fashion Theory. And he concluded in that Christians have a vested interest in participating in the space of fashion as believers in the secular space. In other words, there are good reasons why, as Christians, we should look at fashion, because as believers, we need to operate in the secular world and try and transform it. And he concluded that fashion and theology have what he calls a mutual terrain. If you look at it historically, there are themes that appear. For example, power and social order are important theologically. I've been reading recently about history of Christian England, where that interconnection between the old kings and the old church were very clearly demonstrated. But also, even more recently, people wore clothes to demonstrate their social status, for example, and sumptuary laws were designed in, I think, around the Middle Ages to reinforce that position. Your clothing was there to keep the riffraff out of getting above themselves, if you like. But it's also about questions about time and fashion about transience, and theology often about eternity. And both tell stories about our lives. They're both narratives about who we are or want to be. Now, this is the longest and most detailed slide, and I'm going to touch on it, but there's not enough time to go through it in detail. But it draws from that book by Cavolo and shows how different people over time from within the Christian faith have sought to apply their Christianity to what they wore, starting off with people in Roman times who did not dress differently. They wore the same clothes as pagans to show that they were not subversive, so they could carry on worshipping Christ freely in the Roman world. Early church fathers, Clement, Chrysostom, Tertullian, Augustine, advocated the Christians dress modestly, but at the same time, they often also indicated they understood the aesthetic value brought about by clothing in a beautiful world, that they saw clothing as valid, but people ought to be modest in in how they dress. Calvin, I think, showed some of the tensions in his own writing here. He reinforced those early beliefs that there are good things that God has created for us to use, but he highlighted exposed some of the problems of people abusing God's creation, and highlighted the need to use things in moderation. So, for example, he pointed out how, as you put it, luxury and immoderate expense arise from a desire to make a display, either for the sake of pride or departure from chastity. So there's a sense in which you can show who you are through your clothing and show the beauty of what God's created. But it shouldn't be pointing towards you as the individual, but rather the skills or the person who made the clothes, or the beauty of what they've made. And it certainly obviously shouldn't be there to be sexually provocative. Unduly, perhaps I should say, in caveat. And then Kuyper came along more in the late 19th, 20th century. He was actually someone, Calvinist in origin, but also someone who influenced this shift away from a kind of dualistic thinking to recognize that as Christians we need to bring the material and the spiritual together, and spoke about praising the magnificent attire of clothing. In contrast with Bath, came slightly after Kuyper, who actually had a contrary position where he saw fashion as the outgrowth of sinful humanity. So people have taken different positions over the years. Looking at the clock, I've got a bit more time. So now I want to share with you some of the research that we've done in recent years at Nottingham Trent University. The origins of my work at Nottingham Trent, the report of the top public understanding of sustainable clothing, where I was still at Sheffield Hallam at the time, did some work with a colleague at Nottingham Trent for Defra, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. This was back in 2008. And it was only through that that actually really developed my interest in fashion. And I work with many experts in the fashion department at Nottingham Trent. The series of products, as was mentioned in the introduction, and the next two PowerPoints summarise our findings. And it's probably reasonable, fair to say that at Nottingham Trent, we're regarded, certainly UK, but internationally, as one of the leading research bodies doing work on sustainable fashion. So 8 bullets, I think, here that we learned about. The first is that although there's been an interest in sustainable fashion for many years, purchasing habits have changed very little in recent years. Despite all the talk, all the publicity, the Stacey Dooleys, the BBC reports, Panorama studies, and so on, habits haven't changed. They're very embedded. There's a problem with consumers. Secondly, there's a problem in the industry. Speak to anyone who works in the clothing industry with experience, and they will say that over the past 20, 30, 40 years, there's been a depletion of the technical skills and knowledge needed in clothing new product development teams, indeed throughout the supply chain. And that's a real problem, because some of the problems can be solved technically, not all of them. It's a combination of technical advances and behavioural change that we need. Point 3, there are economic issues here, that fast fashion sits within our growthist, high throughput economy. And what's called the circular economy, and of course, the Green Christians have had at least one seminar on the circular economy in the past. The circular economy demands a different type of product and therefore, by implication, a different type of clothing, one with longer lifetimes, repair and alteration services, and reuse of fabric once the clothing item can't be used anymore. There are real personal issues here and justice issues here. We could all say that, well, everyone ought to wear longer lasting clothes by buying the most expensive, the local shoes, the Patagonia jacket, the Gant jeans and the like. But of course, most people can't do that. So you can't talk like that anymore. And certainly it would be wrong to argue that poor people can therefore have second-hand clothing. We need to find a solution that is socially just and acceptable to all parts of society. Companies have made some progress, and some have been looking at selling their own clothes secondhand. Some have been looking at renting, for example, but mostly they're still locked in to the traditional model of fast throughput and regular change. I mentioned the problem of goods being exported. For those of you who might say, oh, my conscience is clear, I took my old item to an Oxfam shop or whatever, the supply of unwanted garments in second-hand stores far exceeds demand. All these shops sell a fraction of the goods that they get in. Clear majority of items that are given to charity shops are never sold in the UK. At best, they're sold overseas, or worse, they end up in landfill or incinerated. There are, as I mentioned a moment ago, signs of progress, and possibly because of the threat of legislation in this area, not least in the European Union, which will be also applied in the UK, on garment recovery initiatives. So Europe are looking at requiring retailers and manufacturers to actually collect used garments and pay for any recycling and disposal at end of life, and we'll have to follow suit in the UK because it's a global market. And then the last point is that we need systemic and cultural change, which I think has been evident from all I've said. I've not got time to go through these to keep to time. Let me just say a few things. There's a lot of work that's been done on product lifetime. There's a number of reports out there. We know there's a combination of technical solutions in terms of the quality of the fibre being used, the design. So, for example, seams, so you can expand things if you get larger. Many clothes end up being thrown away because they no longer fit. It's a key issue. Testing, we've done a lot of work on testing garments. That's problematic because if we want something to last for a long period of time, the user trials are usually maybe a dozen, 20 wears, and obviously that doesn't say how well it's going to last after the first 5 years or first 6 months or whatever. So there are issues that have to be done there. Big issue about laundering. I've mentioned this a moment ago, but a lot of people really don't know how to launder clothing appropriately, and that can have a big impact on clothing lifetimes. Recycling clothing is good in principle, but there's not much happening in practice. Not least because the technology hasn't been worked through adequately yet. There are different ways of doing it: chemical recycling, mechanical recycling. I won't go into detail now, but there'll be real progress. If you do resign yourself to a world where there'll always be fast fashion, then it's got to become 100% recyclable. That's the only sustainable solution. It's not ideal because recycling still has an environmental impact. The whole process does. But if you do have at least share of the market, which is fast fashion, then recycling is the first step forward. So coming to an end now, hopefully keeping to time. So what do we do? Well, I've said a bit about what individuals need to do, but some of the problems as well. I'm focusing here on a report which we did and we gave into to the government for a committee in 2018, which came out with this second report I mentioned, Fixing Fashion. And again, there's about 8, I think, policy proposals we gave to the politicians. I don't think any of them have been accepted by the government. I'm not wholly convinced that the next government will do them either, whether it's Conservative or Labour, or even a coalition. Gosh, that's a thought. Because these are problems that governments don't seem to want to address any more than issues like obesity, for example. But anyway, we live in hope, and we have to put our ideas out there because that's all we humble folk in academia and NGOs can do. What are the proposals we came up with? Well, first of all, agree standards of longevity with stakeholders to try and get short-lived items off the market. So I've often said to colleagues in different industry sectors, we need guarantees that are at least get the rubbish off the market, the item that basically the seams go after 3 wears or whatever. There should be such standards that those things you cannot sell in the UK. Secondly, we need to do more work on sustainable business models. Companies need help. Governments need to support them to find the right technology, to explore different ways of having consumers wear the products that they produce. It might be hire rather than sale. Who knows in the future? There's interestingly quite a lot of interest, more interest than you might think, in people who want to rent clothes rather than buy them. But the market is still pretty small in that area, tends to be quite top end as well. We also want the government to do durability testing support, because it's quite a complex area. Upcycling. A lot of talked about the second-hand market, but at the end of the day, often parts of clothing just isn't usable anymore. There's fabric there, the sleeves are gone, the collar's gone, there's a stain in the middle. What do you do with that? It's too much like hard work to repair it. Upcycling uses fabric, the actual material, and some upcycling happens, always has done, making other things have to use fabric. More work needs to be done in that area. Improved information to consumers. Some are good, many are not, in terms of doing the right things, buying the right products, looking after their products, and so forth. I've mentioned the need for government to address the second-hand clothing market. It's something that has to be done with the support of government. It could do simple things like, get rid of VAT on second-hand clothes, for example. So there are ways of the government could change markets so it moves in a more sustainable manner. Some of the best work is done at grassroots level, and they aren't just top-down solutions. Repair cafes, they seem to have stabilised, I think, is the best way I can put it, in the last 3 years. They were growing quite rapidly over several years, but since COVID, the one in Sheffield closed down, hasn't recovered. And I think the same is true in other parts of the world. Tell me if your experience is different. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people do want to learn to repair garments. One of the reasons they haven't learned in the past is because of the decline in design technology education. So we need to improve that as well, and we lobbied to government to that end. Economics often changes people's behaviour. If you get rid of national insurance contributions and VAT on repair, that immediately will help people who do repair work to make their work more competitive with buying new garments. Social marketing is something that governments can use, with non-discriminatory between individual companies, but can tell consumers through advertising and mass media, on TV or whatever, how to do the right thing. And then I mentioned a moment ago the need to make producers responsibility for waste. That seemed like it might happen. Here we were lobbying government to introduce that. And the bottom right-hand side is that Fixing Fashion report that came out of the report to which we were submitting this evidence. So to end, what do we do as Christians? Well, as Christians, we have a responsibility to promote good church teaching in our churches, in our youth clubs, in our Christian magazines, whoever, recognizing that there's a role for fashion, but that we have to act in a certain way that understands the goods and bads of the fashion industry. As Christians, we need to challenge industry practices that are unethical or put short-term profit before sustainability. We've all seen the wave of protests over oil and amen to that. But the industry protests, the clothing industry protests, seem to have died down a bit. There's an organisation called Fashion Revolution. That sounds good, doesn't it? Fashion Revolution. How many people even knew that it was their annual Fashion Revolution week only a couple of weeks ago? Passed me by. I saw nothing at all in mass media about that. And so we have a role, as we've done in other areas like poverty, like climate change, to argue and lobby for changes in the fashion industry. And then perhaps more locally, what can we do in our churches? Can we use our church buildings to facilitate change? Maybe hosting a clothing swap, sometimes known as swishing parties. Can we host repair cafes? Can we host second-hand sales? Always historically, churches historically have had jumble sales, but of course there's been a change in the market. Maybe we need to bring them back. You'll see on the right I just found this online by a random search. St Paul's and St Faith's Church in Brentford, they host a clothes repair cafe. So it can be done. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention. I realised there was a lot of information. It all went very quickly, but I'd be delighted to answer questions. David, steer me. Do you want me to put up the questions now, or do you want to give people a chance to breathe?
What is your oldest item of clothing? What's your favourite item of clothing? What is your attitude to clothing reuses? Do you own any second-hand items? And what could the church do to promote more appropriate attitudes and behaviours among Christians? Very quickly, somebody from each, some of the groups, including the one I didn't work, but if we can very quickly, if we could have somebody from, did the room 1, which was Adela, Deborah, Mary, did that function or not? Did somebody from that group have something to say? I think not, because Deborah was in that back in the main. No?
I think we can you hear me? I'm Mary.
Yes, I'm Mary.
I think we ended up thinking that the churches could promote events which emphasize reusing, swapping, sharing, etc. But we had an interesting discussion. Yeah.
I think this is something that we'll also perhaps could talk about to some extent. The next room was room 2 was Alison, Linda, Sarah. Somebody from that group like to say something briefly about what attracted their attention?
Yeah, sure. I'm Alison. We also had a nice discussion. We thought probably the important thing was to deliberate and buy, if you're going to buy carefully, buy if you can afford more pricey things that'll last longer, and try to buy things that are that are good, that'll last. And we all felt that it would be good to use charity shops more, and we all have tried and like shopping at charity shops. And one of us has a sister who does a lot of shopping for nice clothes, and then she gets hand-me-downs, which we thought was quite useful.
I get some hand-me-ups from my son.
Oh, that's nice.
The next room was me and Kathy, but we had problems, technical problems there. But Kathy's put in the chat, as you could see, that since she retired, she doesn't buy clothes, that friends are always giving her clothes. So she actually has to say no these days when people try to give more clothes. So that's a wonderful solution that happened to you. The next group was Heather, Margaret, Rod and Terry. Somebody from that group like to say something in this sort of short time the first couple of people have modelled?
Yeah, all of us had some older items and some favourites. We were quite happy wearing second-hand items, and we thought perhaps the church could do more. The old jumble sales through churches really help local poorer people with clothing, and perhaps think of those sort of things and helping reuse of clothing and repair.
All good. Thank you, Terry. The next group was Barbara, James, Margaret and Sam. Somebody from, I know Barbara was out of this group. Was somebody else like to say something from that group?
Yeah, I don't mind saying something.
Off you go then, Sam.
So we spoke quite a lot about some of our ages of clothing. Quite a few actually superseded my own age, so that's quite impressive. But we then went into the conversation, and Tim, it's something you might be able to elaborate on a little bit, is by not purchasing these clothing, what does that do to jobs in areas where these clothings are made, and what is the impact of that as well? So that's something that we debated a little bit around too. So yeah, it's just one of the conversations that came up in our group.
Thank you, Sam. That's a question I had. I hope Tim has noted that one down, ready to give us the answer that will solve the problem there, because what happens to those jobs is interesting. Room 6 was Barry, Judith, Sophie, and Tony. Would somebody from that group like to speak up?
Yeah, I think we all said we got
Thanks,
some very old clothes. So can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, you're doing well.
And we'd all got our favourites. I think all of us used charity shops. Then we got talking about, well, what do you do with your clothes when you eventually do want to get rid of them? Because most of us do wear them for a very long time. We talked about how's the best way to recycle them. And I shared that I take out all the zips, take off the buttons, I save all those, and then I take them to a charity shop that still takes rags. I know fewer and fewer of them do that. One of the members said that their recycling will take them, and they recycle them into cat litter. My council doesn't. That I have to put them in the black bin if I put them in a bin. But that's something we could worth looking at. What does will your council recycle your clothes? And I do volunteer to Repair Cafe doing fabric clothes repairs. But at the moment, I mean, I'm quite new at that. I've only just started doing that. But one of my fellow sewers said she offered a workshop at a school to do uniform repairs and got no customers at all.
No.
So that was interesting. Whether it was just bad publicity or the wrong day or what, we don't know. But that was disappointing.
It is a strange one, because that used to be sort of par for the course almost for school uniforms.
Yeah.
Let's move on now to the next group. Thank you, Tony. Next group was group 7 was Kathleen, Sheila, and William. Silence from Kathleen, Sheila, William. Nobody. All right, we move on to room 8. Sorry.
Talked about the special use.
William, there we go. All right. Oh, now we've got 2. Kathleen, then.
One of our group spoke about the special use of charity shops for buying something for a special occasion, particularly, good quality stuff that you wouldn't wear otherwise, that you wanted for a wedding or something. That's one way of using charity shops. I said I was just very depressed to hear that they sell such a small percentage of what they get. I feel good when I give them stuff to the charity shop. Now I'm not sure.
No, it's a tricky one, that one. Thank you. Next was room 8, Colin, Jerry, Kathleen, Robert, or Tamsin. Kathleen.
We already heard from Kathleen, so yeah. But
yeah, sorry, I realised there's 2 Kathleens here. It's such a confusion.
Yeah. We became very nostalgic about because most of us are older folks, about all the old things that still fit us in some cases after having been left out a little bit. So that's a good sign, because they were made maybe a longer time ago to a quality that was maintainable in that sort of way. And although some were more like occasional things like dinner suits and so on.
Yeah, we had a church 70s night a few before COVID, and somebody did turn up in clothes they wore in 1970. That was very annoying. So, William, say something from your group, since I got my Kathleen's mixed up, or are you okay? William Offler I'm talking to. You okay?
Yeah, I'm not sure we said. Others might want to correct me. I'm not sure we said an awful lot that hasn't been covered elsewhere. Really, and we never. Really,
all right.
We didn't. Get
okay.
Around to
Thanks
that,
anyway. All right. So we do want to get. So there's Jean, Kathy, Grant, and Peter. Bonsi, one of you would like to say something briefly?
Hello, I'm Kathy.
Yes, hello, Kathy.
Oh, what's that? Somebody got a cat there.
Cat or a baby?
Sorry, my cat. I'm mute.
Yeah, well, I don't think 10 minutes was long enough. We sort of didn't really have time to consider everything. You know, I think breakout rooms are always a bit too short. We discussed a bit about whether men are really interested in charity shops and clothes recycling and that sort of thing. And I said, well, naturally, not all women are very good at sewing and repairing and that sort of thing. I hated it at school. You know, I hated needlework. And I also mentioned about something else which we didn't touch on at all in the talk, but I mean but considering the ethical aspects of clothing, we also have to consider animal welfare. I know not many people wear fur nowadays, but there are other issues such as what's called mulesing, which is a cruel way they treat sheep in Australia, you know, in wool production. Anyway, so we're just going to get on to one or two other things about clothes shops and things, but we ran out of time.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's always hard to work. You know, there's trying to keep things not short, but also giving people time is always tricky. Thank you anyway, Kathy, for that. The last group is Josephine, Nona, and Sue. It also has got Tim's name there, but I think anybody in that group like to say something?
One of the things we raised was the dilemma of it all. I mean, you know, it's not easy to see what the way forward is, apart from using charity shops and hand-me-downs and things. But I mean, should one wear cotton things or fabricated nylon things? They all have very bad effects. I mean, compared with food, I think fashion is much more complicated. Food is simple. We should stop eating animal products, period. That's all there is to say about food. But it's very much more complicated, isn't it? All of these dilemmas that we've been raising tonight. Somebody else from our group perhaps wants to say something.
I think we'll just move on because it's now 3 minutes, but we've theoretically got 12 minutes left. So I think if we just have a short period of questions for Tim, if Tim would like to unmute himself. And perhaps partly using Chair's prerogative, but also because this one came up in one of the questions, was what about all the jobs? What are the alternatives for people who are working in industries that are currently not sustainable?
I think this comes up with any sector of the economy that you want to transform, and you might argue against it for the arms trade, for nuclear power, road building. It's the same problem. You know, people do need jobs. I suppose in the case of clothing, there's a slight difference in that many of the jobs are overseas, and the people are particularly vulnerable. So I suppose the response is that where there are unsustainable industries, there needs to be some kind of transition policy, and that might be for governments to work together and make, for example, aid and development projects linked to their policies on clothing. So we might, for example, work with the Bangladeshi government and say, well, we are going to want to import fewer goods from your company, but here's some money to invest in other businesses that are more sustainable. I mean, it's not an easy one, but I don't think it's an uncommon one, and it's not just the clothing industry that faces that. You know, to become sustainable as an economy, several sectors are going to grow, other decline, and some will grow.
Thanks very much. All right. I mean, so taking further questions, I was going to take one that's Tamsin's out of this chat there. I mean, Tim can see it, but I'll just read it out. I also wondered about the ethics of modeling clothes on tall, thin models instead of a variety of body shapes and sizes. Are most clothes designed to flatter only one kind of body shape?
the industry has changed in recent years, and so now if you do, as I do very occasionally, look in the fashion media and in women's magazines and the like, or even more commonly in the media, generally in the media, some companies have made some progress in this area, particularly gender diversity, ethnic diversity in particular. There's much more variety now, and disability. There are several companies that actually use distinctly, deliberately models who are missing a limb, for example, to demonstrate that the industry isn't trying to mold everybody into one type. That said, there is an issue still, I think a major issue, with size 0 models or whatever the size is now, that you still are expected to be slim. And while there are more body shapes and sizes, anyone who looks at the promotion of women's clothing, often they will be using people who are less narrowly waist, if I put it like that. But there is this progress, particularly I think in the where you have fashion shows. I think some of those are still fairly worrying in terms of models there.
Okay, thanks. Adela, I think, I'm not sure about the order in which the hands came up, but Adela, would you like to go next? Unmute yourself, please.
Thank you. I was interested in the comment that there was a rise in consumption from 2012 to 2016. And I just wondered if you knew the reason for that. Or was it because population has increased? So was it just, percentage similar, or was the percentage different as well?
That's a good question in terms of consumption per head. The statistic wasn't, it was a UK consumption, and it obviously was a slight increase in population. But I think the key point there is that WRAP, who came up with that figure, were campaigning to see a reduction, and for them, that was disappointing. That they actually wanted to see a significant decrease in the volume of clothes consumed. And in fact, we'd seen the reverse. Even if it was stabilised at 1 million tonnes a year, that wouldn't be good enough. We need to have a world where far fewer tonnes of clothing are consumed each year. That was the last figure I've seen. I did before presenting tonight. I have a look to see if there is any more up-to-date figures than 2017, but there aren't any that I've come across. But I think you're right. There might be an effect of rising population. But what we're looking for is a substantial decrease, and there's no decrease yet.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've seen there's Catherine's got a question comment in the chat, which perhaps we'll follow up in a second. I see Colin's got a hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. I should defer to Catherine because I think she put her hand up first, but thank you, Chairman. Anyway, I have a slightly more technical question, being a bit of an academic, and also looking at supply chains. And I have an example of supply chain where cotton is grown in a sort of agribusiness in Louisiana, in the US, is shipped to Indonesia for the carding and spinning and weaving. Then it's either the garment's either made up in Bangladesh if it's the woman's one, or in Colombia in South America if it's the man's one, and then they go back to Walmart and they're sold for $5 in Walmart back in the US. And out of that $5, 7 cents is the cost of the transportation. So that's the price of the transportation, not the impact of the transportation. But I wondered if you have got data, and maybe it's in the reports, just tell me to look there if it is, about the whole life cycle cost, because this question of the washing that you already mentioned is something that I don't hear people talking about very much. And that, for example, poly, I mean, I do a lot of sporty type things. I'm a cyclist, not a road professional, but, an everyday cyclist. And poly things are more comfortable and functional in that role, but also they rinse out when they get wet and sticky, whereas cotton is foul, to be quite blunt, and then takes a lot of washing, more powder, more water, and more energy. Is that taken into account? Is the data, and anybody done any studies on that sort of thing?
Well, there are a number of issues there, one's the transport, and then this stuff that's going all around the world, and there's research at the RSA who's done a lot of work on exactly that problem. That it's to do with volume. If you have so many millions and millions of garments, which obviously Walmart do have, the actually unit cost of shipping them across the world, usually on boats with few workers on them, so relatively cheap. It's commercially appropriate, and not appropriate, but it's commercially best for that company to operate in that way and go to the point of the world where they specialise in that. I mean, we haven't really had the kind of move towards local clothing, and we have in local food. I mean, I know the local food movement seems to have died a death in recent years, but there has actually been a bit of talk about reshoring of manufacturing in the clothing industry, and it was in particular because of the high profile that was being given to some of the scandals in the fashion industry, and in particular companies that generally wanted to do the right thing and found out, for example, that child labour was being used in some obscure underground room in Bangladesh, and unless they have someone on site the whole time, these things can move quite quickly. So there are real problems with any kind of globalized industry where component parts are put together where it's cheapest. As for the question of polyester, yes, I'm the proud owner of an Umbro tracksuit, which I still wear, and I certainly have been wearing for at least 30 years. Even if I wanted it to wear out, it will not wear out. It looks as good as the day I had it. So clothing can be made to last, but things have purposes. I wouldn't, want to wear that on a day-to-day basis. I find on day-to-day basis I'm much happier wearing cotton or wool garments than synthetic. Obviously, we all differ in that regard. But as I said at the outset of the presentation, unfortunately, there's not an easy answer with this. It really is a case of you try and live within integrity. Certainly now, I'd be disinclined to buy polycotton rather than cotton if I wanted to try and promote recycling, because I know that is an issue. At the same time, I know there are academics who are trying to have a technical solution for polycotton, because obviously it is better than cotton in terms of its durability. So no, there aren't any easy answers, and all we can do is try and do what we can and communicate that because it's complicated, it's inappropriate to say do nothing. Lots of things are inappropriate. I eat some food that wasn't grown in Yorkshire. That's life. We do what we can. But getting well-informed Christians and getting more Christians to realise that being Christian, when it comes to consumption, is not just buying fair trade coffee. There are a lot of other things we spend our money on, but there are real ethical issues that we need to address.
Thank you, Tim. We are starting to run out of time. There are two more, but perhaps can you do a one-sentence answer for which could pressure be applied on football clubs regarding how often they change their kit?
Yes.
Okay, yes is the answer. Catherine also, she put this comment in the chat much earlier. I think it's probably more comment than question, but clearly it raises very interesting questions about clothes going from the north to the south, the problems that might cause, whether competing with local industry or landfill or so forth. Anyway, since we are really out of time, we're going to finish. I have a final closing prayer, and then I'd like to say something briefly about the next talk, and then we'll finish. So if we pray together. Creator God, you made all people in your image, and you call us to be a neighbor to all. Thank you for all we have explored this evening about the impacts of clothing choices, fashion culture, and economic strategies. Keep us mindful of the inextricable link between us and producers of clothing, so that we will be ethical in purchases, move to action to challenge oppression, and ready to spread consumer awareness for sustainability. May we have compassion on our neighbours, however far away, and may we and others find joy in enough. Amen.